Welcome to the Emerald City Sportscast, hosted by longtime Northwest sports journalist Dan Viennes. News, analysis, and opinions from Dan and his guests on the Mariners, Seahawks, Kraken, and more. And now, here's your host, Dan Viennes.
Yeah, I'm still alive, still here, still know how to work a mixing board, apparently. We have not talked since the NFL draft. But there are reasons for that, but there are reasons to get back on, too. There's just going to be some good stuff to talk about over the next couple of months. The Seahawks open training camp this week, of course. A much different-looking Seahawks roster than we've seen in a long time. But that lends itself to some interesting analysis and conversation, right? So we'll get back into that. We'll knock the dust off of this thing, bring back the ECS. But we're going to talk baseball today. We're going to talk exclusively baseball. And there's a couple of good reasons for that. Number one, your Seattle Mariners are right in the thick of a playoff race. And regardless of how poorly they've played against the Houston Astros since the All-Star break, no reason to jump ship yet. We'll talk about the playoff race specifically near the end of the show, and I'll kind of hopefully talk you away from the ledge as far as what's been going on against the Astros. You got the Yankees coming up. Tough stretch to come out of the break for sure, but things are looking up. And things are looking up as far as the Seattle Mariners starting rotation goes, and potentially as far as their winning window goes. Now, we are in year 4 after they decided to tear it down and rebuild, right? End of 2018 was when they made that call. And we've debated back and forth over the last year or so about what that timeline was going to look like and when they were going to, quote unquote, go for it and make those big acquisitions. And a lot of people wanted it to happen at the trade deadline last year because they thought there was a chance that team could make the playoffs, and they almost did, even despite any of the big deals. And then this offseason, there was a lot of consternation about not going out, landing one of the big fish, Chris Bryant, Trevor Story, Marcus Semien. We've been down that road. But the Seattle Mariners just went and did something that they haven't done in a very long time. They just made a significant trade. And what might go down as the biggest trade of the deadline, unless, of course, Juan Soto is moved by the Nationals, which it sounds like he may be. So this would be the second biggest move as far as the national media is concerned, but certainly the biggest move concerning pitching, because the Seattle Mariners just acquired the best available starting pitcher on the market. Luis Castillo is now a Mariner, will pitch Monday against the New York Yankees. If you don't know who Luis Castillo is, first of all, if you don't know who Luis Castillo is, then you're probably not much of a Mariner fan, and you shouldn't certainly be weighing in on whether or not this was a good trade or not. There's a lot of people out there doing that. We'll get into that. Luis Castillo, 29 years old, 2-time All-Star, starting pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds. He is a legitimate ace. He is a guy that can pitch at the top of your rotation against a good team in the playoffs. Robbie Ray now becomes your number 2. Castillo, a 4-pitch pitcher, misses bats, not quite as many as he did 2 or 3 years ago, but he strikes out about 10 per 9, walks some guys. His walk rate's about 3 per 9 this year. And that's actually touched down from his last couple of years. But he misses enough bats to make it worth it. And he also is a ground ball pitcher. He induces ground balls at more than 50% of the time. He's durable, never really had any health issues, had a little bit of a sore shoulder coming out of spring this year, and there was a little bit of hesitation about how that would affect his trade market, but he bounced right back, and he's been great. So durability shouldn't be a concern. And the thing I like the most about this dude is when you watch him pitch, he's just fun to watch. He's got some swag to him. He's got some flair on the mound. He's demonstrative. I think Seattle Mariner fans are going to take to this guy really quickly, and they're going to love him, and they're going to like the results, especially given that Robbie Ray struggled his last couple of times out. But that's another issue for another time. Both times against the Houston Astros, and again, we'll talk about that. Now, what did they give up in the trade? You got to give to get, and this is where a lot of the debate's been over the last 12 hours since this trade went down. They give up Noelvi Marte, 20-year-old shortstop, number one prospect in their system by most lists. Edwin Arroyo, 18-year-old shortstop, second-round draft pick last year out of high school. Starting pitcher Levi Stout was pitching at Double-A for Arkansas, and relief pitcher Andrew Moore. So by most lists, Marte and Arroyo were their top two prospects. Jason Churchill actually had Arroyo as his number one. They're also both in the top 100 of most scouting services lists. And in fact, I saw this morning that Marte and Arroyo was around the 50-ish mark. And that's all happened this year. He was drafted out of high school last year, and he's just had a tremendous first season in rookie ball. Switch hitting shortstop, legitimate defensive shortstop, and a guy that's hitting over 300 with a little bit of pop and some upside. The kind of prospect that you salivate over. Marte, the jury's been a little bit more out, in part because he really exploded physically the last couple of years, really outgrew the shortstop position. Even though he's been playing shortstop every day in Everett, went and saw him a couple times myself earlier this year. He just doesn't look like a shortstop. He doesn't have the hands or the instincts, but he's just too big for the position. There's some thought he can move to third base. He has the arm for it. But some feel he's not necessarily a polished enough infielder that move would make sense either, and he might end up at a corner spot in the outfield. Regardless, got off to a slow start this year, but he's really exploded with the bat in the last month or so. And the biggest upside when it comes to Marte used to be his speed. He used to be, some scouting services had him as a 70 grade runner when he was younger. Not that anymore, but it's the power upside that scouts love about Marte. Could be a guy that could hit 30, 35 home runs. In the big leagues, and if you really dream on him, some people see Manny Machado in there if he really puts the hit tool all together. So a lot to give up. A lot to give up, of course. But if you were to get on Twitter right now and type in Luis Castillo trade, you're going to see all sorts of different opinions. Some people I've seen literally saying the Mariners fleeced the Reds on this one. And other people saying that the Reds fleeced the Mariners. And what I always say with trades like this is why can't both be true, right? Why can't both be true? Why can't both teams benefit from this? I think back to the trade we made with the Diamondbacks, where we gave up Taijuan Walker and Ketel Marte, and we got back Mitch Haniger and Gene Segura at the time. And at the time, nobody knew who Mitch Haniger was. And so the immediate reaction to that trade was, what are the Mariners doing? Segura's not worth Walker and Marte. Walker got hurt, bounced around. Marte's become an all-star for them, for the Diamondbacks. Meanwhile, Segura helped land J.P. Crawford. He still continues to pay dividends out of that trade. And Mitch Haniger has been injury-prone, but when he's played, he was an all-star. That's a trade that I think you can say both teams benefited from. And why can't this be one of them too? And here's where I'm at on this. I'm 100% in favor of this trade. Seeing the names, losing Marte and Arroyo, it hurts, but does it? Like, I've seen Marte play a couple times in person. Have you? And I wasn't that impressed. But it's even if I was, what's his ETA? Maybe if he puts it all together, 2024, probably 25, because you got to figure the defensive part out of this. Because no matter what you think about whether or not he was their number one prospect or what kind of player he might be, and I'm not a scout, right? I'm just a guy that's watched baseball my whole life and is passionate about this organization. Noelvin Marte is not Julio Rodriguez. And Edwin Arroyo, how many of you knew who he even was until last night? Right? And think back to last year's draft. There was a lot of criticism that the Mariners went so heavily with high school players. And I saw Mariner fans last year bitching about that because they want a quick turnaround. They want immediate dividends. They can wrap their heads around who Emerson Hancock was, because he was a big-time pitcher and a name who had been talked about as a potential number one pick 2 years ago in the draft. Pitched for a big-time program. He was in the College World Series. He was on national TV. And they could see, he might be ready in 2 years. That's a good pick. Nobody knew who Edwin Arroyo was last year when we took him in the second round out of high school, including me. But you read about how he's playing in rookie ball this year and you get excited about him. Let's talk about the rest of the package, though, because this is really all about Marte and Arroyo. Levi Stout is nothing special. They gave him a shot in spring training to win the fifth starter job. And he had a good first start. Then he really wasn't that spectacular. And now he's been pitching in Double-A all year. And by all accounts, you look at the numbers, he's the Travelers' fourth best starting pitcher behind Taylor Dollard, who we'll talk about in a second, Emerson Hancock, and Bryce Miller, actually, who they just promoted from Everett. I think has a little more upside than Levi Stout did. Churchill, who I have all the respect for in the world, thinks he's a reliever at the big league level. And Andrew Moore is purely a reliever. Now, he's up to 100 miles an hour, and some say he's got a wipeout slider. But he wasn't on our prospect lists, and he's probably, I've seen him referred to as an organizational arm. This is about Marte and Arroyo. This is what I'll say about trades in general, and then we'll get into specifically now why the Mariners were willing to give up this package. Trades are always about risk, especially prospect for proven talent trades. Noelvi Marte and Edwin Arroyo could go out and be all-stars 4 or 5 years from now. Marte could move to third, Arroyo could stick at shortstop, and the Cincinnati Reds have a left side of the infield that's 2 all-stars in 4 years. Let's say that happens. Does that mean the Mariners lost the trade? Not if Luis Castillo helps them get to the playoffs in back-to-back years, something they haven't done in 21 years. Not if he helps them contend for the World Series. Not if they sign him to an extension and he continues to anchor the rotation and extends the Mariners' window, and now they become a perennial contender. So let's wait and see. I'll even go this far. This is how I feel about trades. I really do. Luis Castillo could go out there Monday against the Yankees and blow his ulnar collateral ligament and have to have Tommy John surgery. And it wouldn't mean it was a bad trade. It would mean they'd lose the trade if he never is the same guy again, or at least for the Mariners. But that's the risk you take. And here's why. And here's why, if you follow me on Twitter, you've seen me say this. I was as excited as any of you of the prospect of getting Juan Soto. He was talked about even as recently as 2 days ago. Jim Bowden, I think, or Steve Phillips, one of those national guys that used to be a GM, said that there was a report that the Mariners were one of 4 teams. It was Bob Nightingale. One of 4 teams that had been the most aggressive in going after Juan Soto. So it sounds like there may have been an offer made for Soto. That's exciting, right? You pair Soto with Julio Rodriguez, 2 Dominican guys, 2 young Dominican guys, haven't even begun to reach their ceiling yet. One from the left side, one from the right side. Forget about whether or not you could re-sign Soto in a couple of years, keep him long-term. That would have been fun. But I think you would have had to gut the upper end of your minor league system and your major league roster a little bit in a way that might not have offset the addition of Soto to the point that you'd be hurting yourselves as a playoff contender this year. You probably would have had to include one of your young bullpen arms, maybe an Andres Munoz. Kelnick would have been in the deal for sure. Hancock, maybe even Kirby, some of those names that have been tossed around that the Nationals didn't want to take the 18-year-olds. They see themselves as a team that can spend, and they didn't want to do a long, full teardown and rebuild. So as exciting as Juan Soto would have been for everybody, that cost would have hurt a little bit more. But I would also say that there are some reasons to think that this Mariners lineup is going to be much better over the next month. And it's been debated to death. It's been talked about to death. We know it. And there's a lot of ifs involved. And there's a lot of risk here in counting on this. Kyle Lewis is back, although we can't play every day. Well, he I don't know if he can't, but they're being very, very cautious about his workload. Ty France is back, and while he might not be 100% yet with that elbow, hit a home run the other night to dead center field. That he sure looked healthy then, and he's going to be fine. You've got all the guys have their suspensions behind him, and now Mitch Haniger is into his second week in his minor league rehab and looks to be close to returning. Now, I get it. Lewis might get hurt again. Haniger might get hurt again, right? And there's other guys that have to improve. Jesse Winker was hot as heck going into his suspension, and then he's not so good lately. But you look at Jesse Winker's 5-year history in the major leagues, and there's more reason to believe he's going to return more. He's going to be closer to what he's been for the last 5 years than what he's been for the last 5 months. There's more reasons to believe that. And Julio. Now we get a whole second. Well, it's not a half anymore. They call it the second half. It's really a third of the season that's left. You get that lineup healthy, and I think they'll score some runs. And there's still time to do some things. The deadline's not until Monday. And even though some people are up in arms about Jerry DiPoto coming out and saying we'd like to add a bat, but I'm not sure if that market's there, but we're always in on things. Look, he's making calls and he's taking calls. He's trying to find another bat. If he can find another versatile bat, a guy that can play second, third, some outfield, or a backup catcher that can play a couple times a week, take some of the pressure off Raleigh and be productive at the plate, he'll do that. But finding aces is maybe the hardest thing in all of baseball. It might be congruous to finding a quarterback that you can win with in the NFL. Hardest thing to do. We're seeing that with the Seahawks right now. They went out, and maybe more so than at any time since their Super Bowl run, I think, they improved their roster, and they've added layers of depth and young talent to it, that this roster is set up to be very good for the next couple of years if they can develop it. But you gotta find a quarterback. There's a plan in place. I think it involves next year's draft, which looks like one of the best quarterback drafts in years. But there's risk. There's no guarantee. You just don't know. The hardest thing in baseball, unless you're the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Red Sox and just go out and buy it and outbid everybody and buy the best free agents every year, is finding and developing and acquiring aces. Robbie Ray's not an ace. Could Logan Gilbert be an ace? Maybe. He's still young. He's only in his first full season in Major League Baseball. George Kirby be an ace? Maybe. But he's not even going to be able to play a full season this year because they're watching his innings. And I don't know that there's another guy in the system that could develop into that guy. Although Emerson Hancock right now, the way he's pitching in Double-A has kind of restored my confidence, and I think a lot of people's confidence that follow the Mariners, that, oh, this is the guy that was talked about as being potentially the first pick in the draft 2 years ago. Now that he's healthy, he was the most electric pitcher at the Futures game, and he picked up where he left off. He just had another great start the other night. But finding guys like Luis Castillo who are available is tough. And again, to use the quarterback analogy, it reminds me of something I always used to talk to my dad about. He used to hate Matt Hasselbeck. Hated him. Thought he was terrible. You know, everything's black and white. He's either great or he's terrible. And some people felt this way about Russell Wilson, but Hasselbeck's the better analogy. And I would always engage him and say, okay, Dad, then let's just bear with me for a second. Humor me. What's Hasselbeck? Maybe the 15th best quarterback in the league? Some optimistically might have said he was the 10th or 12th best quarterback in the league at the time, whatever. And I would find a number that he would agree with. Yeah, okay. He's the 15th best quarterback in the league. All right. Who are the other 14, right? And we'd figure out the names. How are you going to get one of those guys? They're not available. They're not. The Mariners went out and acquired one of the best available starting pitchers on the market this offseason. The reigning Cy Young winner, Robbie Ray, the American League. And maybe it was because of the timing of it that it happened right before the lockout and all of that, but people didn't want to give them enough credit for that. But that was a sign that Jerry recognized that, like, we like Gilbert, we like Kirby, we like Hancock, we like these guys coming up, but they're not going to be full-time pitchers for a couple of years, and we're not sure that they're aces either. And he even said as far back as spring training, and now yesterday we saw the fruition of it. He had been saying adamantly and transparently as possible since spring training, we would like to add another pitcher to our rotation, and preferably a guy that pitches at the top of the rotation. So he's recognized this as a need, and now we're seeing reports all the way back to last year's trade deadline and the winter meetings. There were discussions. Guys like Luis Castillo are harder to find. Now, the cost. Was it high? Yeah, it was high. There are experts out there saying it was high. Two things. Cost of acquiring a player like this is always going to be higher at the deadline than it is in the offseason because you have an uneven playing field. In the offseason, A, everybody thinks they have a chance to improve their roster. And B, whatever holes might be created from a trade in the offseason, you have time and resources and the ability to go out and fill those holes then before you start playing games. Now you have to balance that, right? It's like the guy sometimes, the kid with the 10 fingers and there's 11 holes in the dike. You can't plug them all. So again, to use the Soto analogy, if you were to go out and acquire Soto, but you had to give up major league pieces, well, this roster is not good enough, not deep enough to be able to absorb those and still make a deep playoff run. You'd have to then turn around and go find players to acquire to fill those holes. And now you don't have as much in the bank to go make those purchases because you spent a bunch of it on Juan Soto. To get Luis Castillo, they traded two guys that we're not going to see for years. And there's always way more risk in projecting 18, 19, 20-year-old prospects than there are older prospects. And again, it's just about those two guys. I'm not worried about Levi Stout becoming an ace, and I'm not worried about Andrew Moore becoming an elite closer. Could happen. But again, to me, it's worth the risk. Also, keep in mind, for those of you who think that I've seen it. I've seen the extreme opinions out there. Tapoto's an idiot. This just proves it. Time to fire him. Move on. Terrible trade. Just Google Luis Castillo trade talk and look back over reports that have been written over the last couple of weeks. There were as many as 10 or 12 teams engaging with the Reds about acquiring Luis Castillo, including all of the heavy hitters. The Dodgers, Yankees, Red Sox, Cardinals, Philly, all these organizations that have big-time prospects to trade. Yankees could have outbid us. You start talking about Andrew Volpe, now you're talking about a shortstop that's almost ready. The Dodgers could have outbid us. And those teams know that they can give up prospects because they can just go out in the offseason and sign whoever they want to sign as a free agent. They're an attractive destination, and they have all the money in the world to sign those guys. So, the Mariners were up against a trade deadline pressure, and I've seen quotes this morning from, Andrew Friedman in Tampa Bay, and a couple of GMs who have said, and Jerry Dipoto himself, deadline trades are always going to cost you more because there's a more desperate market. And also with the expanded playoffs, there are fewer sellers now. Who else was on the market other than Luis Castillo for teams that want a big-time 1 or a 2 to add to their playoff rotation? Frankie Montas? There's concerns about his shoulder. Had to miss a couple of starts coming out of the All-Star break. There weren't a lot of other options. So the Mariners were going up against the heavy hitters. They were going up against, let's say, 10 other teams and a deadline. And it's a hard deadline now. Can't do the waiver thing anymore. Here's my last point on this. I would venture to guess that many of the same people slamming the Mariners today for overpaying in prospect cost to get Luis Castillo, a bona fide ace, are most likely the same people who also slam the organization for not overpaying to get Trevor Story or Chris Bryant. Right? When now we're talking free agency, you can't make those guys come here. That's why trades can be so valuable for an organization like the Mariners. Player doesn't have a choice. But now I want to take this to the next level. And I want to talk about, this isn't just about 2022. And I think this is a really, really important aspect of this deal. And it's one of the reasons I like it so much. This is about 2023 also. Even with Luis Castillo on this roster, it's a flawed roster, right? There isn't enough guaranteed offensive production up and down that lineup. They're still going to have to win with pitching, defense, timely hitting. They're going to play a lot of close games. The bullpen's going to have to be as good in the last third as it was in the first 2/3. And Jerry did say he's looking to add a bullpen arm, and I think that's obvious, especially given Castillo going on the injured list and Giles not being healthy. You're going to have to win the same way. You're not going to go out now just because Lewis and Haniger are back and outslug teams. You're not. But it's also about 2023. When you can go out in the offseason, you can address some of those other needs I just discussed, and you'll also start to get some of the upper end of that system producing fruit. You know what one of the things I love the most about this trade is? Jared Kelenic is still a Mariner. Okay, let's look at our, first of all, while I'm on that subject, let's look at our prospect list again. And let's just kind of look at, if I can figure out where I put it. Here we go. So here's what we still have, right? For those of you, all the consternation over trading Marte and Arroyo and Stout. Didn't have to trade Harry Ford, our first-round pick from last year. Didn't have to touch Emerson Hancock, right? Didn't have to touch Taylor Dollard, who's much better than Stout, pitching in Double-A. And some scouts, I've read this in multiple reports, say could pitch in the major leagues right now. He's been the biggest breakout guy in the organization this year. He's breaking out this year the way Gilbert did after his first full season in the minors. Didn't have to touch Alberto Rodriguez, Gabriel Gonzalez, Adam Macko, Zach DeLoach. Didn't have to trade Jared Kelenic. Is Kelenic going to be the superstar that we had thought and hoped when he was acquired? Maybe not. Is he a lost cause? Absolutely not. 23 years old. He's done everything the organization has asked him to do since going down to Tacoma. His stance, his approach, his setup at the plate looks better. He's hitting the ball to all fields. He's not trying to hit home runs every night. He's being productive. He's the kind of guy you want in the clubhouse. He and Julio are boys. He's a gym rat. He's got some fight in him. He's got some swag to him. He's handling the demotion well. I still hold out hope that Jared Kelenic can be a really productive everyday player as early as next year. And he might have to produce some at-bats in September and October this year. Didn't have to touch him. He would have most certainly been gone in a Juan Soto deal. I would have been okay with that. But then I think we would have had some pitching issues. So didn't have to touch those other guys. Here's another way to look at this. So we gave up two players that right now are considered shortstops. Here's what the Mariners have done in the last 4 weeks and will do in the next 8 weeks. Just drafted Cole Young, high school shortstop, in the first round. Again, none of you knew who Arroyo was when he was drafted in the second round last year. Cole Young is a first rounder. He's considered one of the best high school hit tools in the draft. A guy that scouts say will stay at shortstop. A guy people rave about his makeup, his work ethic, the swing. A guy who may move more quickly through the minor leagues than Arroyo will, or might arrive at the same time. And then there's Felnin Celestin. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you haven't heard of this kid, think Noelvi Marte. Think Julio Rodriguez. Because acquiring and developing talent in the minor leagues in baseball isn't just about drafting. Marte was an international signing. Rodriguez was an international signing. Felnin Celestin, 16-year-old Dominican. 6'2", 200, but scouts say 100% will stick at shortstop. It hasn't been made official yet because The signing period doesn't begin until September. But if you Google Felon in Celestin, you'll find video of this guy taking batting practice, decked out in Mariner gear. Hat, gloves, shirt, shorts, socks, shoes, Mariners. It has been reported for up to a year now that he's agreed to sign with the Mariners for over $4 million, about $4.5 million, it sounds like. He's been described as being on the Mount Rushmore of international prospects over the last 10, 12 years, on a level with Wander Franco. And I'm not saying he's as good a prospect or as good a player. There are more questions about his hit tool. But I was just reading this morning a scout saying his scores are 70 across the board. That this guy he's dripping with upside. Left-handed hitter with power, incredible athlete who can play third at an elite or shortstop at an elite level and stay there. So you've essentially already replaced Arroyo with another player who's the same age and might be a little more polished in the eyes of some scouts. And you've essentially replaced Marte with a guy 4 years younger, but who could have just as much upside. Let's talk about prospect cost. Again, this is one of those things where I think people get really carried away in what could be. What about now? And what about next year? Haven't we been crying to the gods for the last 20 years as Mariner fans to just put something together that's sustainable? I feel like this is a case of people want to have their cake and eat it too, or they're just never satisfied. What have we heard about Mariners ownership for the last 20 years? They don't try hard enough. They don't care about winning. I just want them to go for it. I want them to give a shit. I've been arguing for 4 years that the biggest sign that this new ownership, which some people lose sight of the fact that John Stanton is not Nintendo, this newer ownership group gave Dipoto the keys to a complete and total teardown. And anyone who thought at the time, or still thinks now, that that was a sign that ownership doesn't care, doesn't want to win, just isn't seeing it the right way. Because you know what happens when you tear down and rebuild? People stop coming to the ballpark. People stop caring. They stop buying jerseys and hats and shirts. They stop buying 16-game packages. You lose revenue. The way to make money is to win. Tearing down and allowing your GM to do that was a very far-sighted attempt at kind of looking at how the sausage is made inside your own factory and figuring out a way to improve it. And by all accounts, Jerry Dipoto executed that almost perfectly. Most people agree with that. The question has been, well, now what? And I remember, again, I'll reference Jason Churchill. I remember sitting in his studio 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, right after the teardown had started. The deals had been made. Cano had been offloaded to the Mets. We had gotten Kelnick. We had made the Paxton deal. Diaz was gone. We had all those prospects in return. And I remember Church at the time saying, I think he's done this perfectly. Every single move has been executed perfectly. He maximized as good as anyone possibly could have the value of the assets he had on his major league roster and turned them into young assets that you can build around. But he even said back then, and he's stuck with this ever since, and it's stuck with me, don't know if this guy can win yet. Don't know if he can build a major league roster capable of winning in the playoffs and being a World Series contender. But this is the first time we've seen him make a trade like this. So now let's see what happens. And it comes on the heels of the acquisition of Robbie Ray. It comes on the heels of, look, they engaged with Chris Bryant and Trevor Story, offered some significant money, were rebuffed, pivoted to the Winker and Suarez trade. And there's been some uneven results from that, right? Winker hasn't been what he's been, and we need him to be. Suarez carried the team at times in the first half. Has cooled off, but he's been playing solid third base. He gives you some power potential. He's a great guy in the clubhouse. I don't think anyone at this point would argue that he's anything less than what Kyle Seager was giving you at third base last year. So we're starting the pieces come together of how he might build a major league roster. The Ken Giles move last year hasn't paid off yet, but the foresight of signing a guy when he's hurt, benefiting from that with the cost, and with the hope that he could put it together and give you something next year. The same thing, including Andres Munoz in the Ty France deal from the Padres. We're starting to see some of those pieces come together. And there's going to be some real discussions in the offseason about, okay, now let's take the next step. Because as much as some of you thought that last season was the time to go for it and that they could somehow make enough quality acquisitions last offseason to be a World Series contender this year, and now here we go, we're off and running. The Mariners are good again. I never felt like that was the right time. This coming offseason absolutely will be. Because now you have Julio. You know what you have in him. You got to build around that dude. You have Ty France. You have J.P. Crawford locked up long-term. You have Winker for another couple of years. Suarez for a couple more years. You have some pieces you know about. Kelnick should be a producer next year. You know exactly where your weaknesses are in your lineup now, and you can go address them. Because now let's talk about this rotation, shall we? Let's talk about this rotation. As it looks right now, Luis Castillo, Robbie Ray, Logan Gilbert. Then you have Marco Gonzalez, Chris Flexen. Now let's look ahead to 23. You have George Kirby with the gloves taken off a little bit. You have Emerson Hancock on the verge. We'll probably be tripping. Tripping. Let's hope he's not tripping. Will probably be pitching in AAA next year. Taylor Dollard as well. So you're going to have two guys. You go to a Tacoma game right now, that rotation is made up of journeymen and emergency relief guys in case someone gets hurt. AAA minor league filler. Won't be the case next year. You're going to have Dollard, Hancock, maybe even Bryce Miller pitching in Tacoma next year, a step away from the major leagues, guys with upside. Flexen's deal expires this year, but he's arbitration eligible for the next couple of years. So there's value in that. You could trade him this offseason, and because he has controllability and he's at a modest cost, but he's a good, solid back-end starter, there's some value in that. You can recoup some of that. Marco Gonzalez is signed through 23 at a reasonable number, about $6.5 million. Then it really jumps up in 24 to 12.5, I think. And then there's a $15 million option the next year. So if you feel good enough about that rotation going into next year with Castillo, Ray, Gilbert, Kirby, and then whoever's five, could be Flexen, Hancock could be ready. You could acquire another guy. You could trade Marco Gonzalez and get decent value for him this offseason. So now there's depth, and you have other guys on the way that we didn't have to touch. Levi Stout is not a guy we're going to miss. It reminds me of when we traded the other Andrew Moore a few years ago, and people freaked out about that. Or Nick Nieder to the Florida Marlins, or whatever they're called now. The Miami, I don't know. Everybody was up in arms about that because at the time he was maybe our best pitching prospect, but that was more of a statement about where the system was at the time than it was about his talent. He hasn't done anything. You're not going to miss Levi Stout, but you're going to like Emerson Hancock, Taylor Dollard, Bryce Miller, some of those guys that are coming. So 23 now is looking, your rotation might be discussed as one of the best youngish rotations in the league. And so you'd have to go out and address the lineup. So I love where we're at. It's going to be fun to watch. Another thing I want to talk about is this. Let me just look this up real quick. Because yes, this week's been bad. It's been bad. since they came out of the break. They were on a hot streak, obviously winning 14 straight going into the break. And then you come out and you have to play Houston 3 times. You get swept by them in 3 close-ish games. Then you go sweep the Rangers. And then you go back to Houston. You lose a tough one on Thursday night. You get blown out last night. They play again today and tomorrow. Luis Castillo makes his debut in New York on Monday. But let's talk about that because this is what the schedule still looks like for the next week. We finish out 2 more in Houston and then 3 more in New York. But folks, today and tomorrow in Houston, it's the last time we have to see the Houston Astros this year until maybe the playoffs. Then we go to the Yankees for 3, and then we get the Yankees for 3 at home next week. But here is the schedule the rest of the way. Going into the break, I'd seen a stat that only 25% of the remaining Mariners schedule was against teams with winning records. Well, most of that was right out of the chute. So they go to New York for 3, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then they come home, 4 against the Angels, then the 3 against the Yankees. And who knows what the roster will look like by then because there may be other additions. Then you have a 10-game road trip or 9-game road trip against the division other than the Astros. Rangers, Angels, A's. Then you come home against the Nationals and Guardians. Then you go to Detroit and Cleveland. Then you come home to play the White Sox, the Braves, and the Padres. Then you go another long road trip, Angels, A's, Royals, and then you finish with an 8-game homestand, a 9-game homestand. Rangers, A's, and you finish with 4 against the Tigers. That's the schedule the rest of the way. So my final question, for those of you freaking out about this deal, they gave up too much. Or I've seen people have actually written this, right? Typed it on Twitter. So it lasts forever. That the Mariners are terrible, that they're horrible after losing a couple to the Astros. We saw with the 14-game winning streak, and I've always said this, things are usually never as bad as they seem or as good as they seem. And that applies to life, sports, whatever. Are the Mariners as bad a team as we saw in June when they were 12 games under 500 and it looked like they were spiraling and everybody wanted Service and Dipoto fired? Of course not. Were they as good a team as we saw winning 14 straight? Was that sustainable? Of course not. The answer usually lies somewhere in the middle. It's a good baseball team that by all accounts should make the playoffs. If the playoffs started today, they'd be the second wild card. You look at who they're battling against. You look at the teams behind them. I think there's a 3-game cushion against the Guardians, or there were at least heading into yesterday. And you get out of this stretch over the next 7 days. And then you have best rotation they've had in a very long time against a favorable schedule with other additions coming. Not the least of which is at least Mitch Haniger. So love the trade. Hope there's more. And I'm already looking ahead to next year as well, because I think this is going to be maybe the most fun offseason we've had as Mariner fans in 20 years. But we're going to have a playoff race for the next 2 months. We're going to have Seahawk football starting, and we're still going to be focused mainly on the Mariners. Like, when was the last time we were able to do that? That's going to be fun. That's going to be a lot of fun. I think barring disaster, it's a playoff team. We're going to get to watch that build. That ballpark's going to be full, and they're going to be fun to watch. And listen, one last note, we'll talk about this as the season progresses, but for those of you saying, no, the reason they lost this trade is there's no way they're going to keep Luis Castillo. He's going to walk in a year and a half and go be an all-star somewhere else while Marte and Arroyo develop in Cincinnati. Luis Castillo is Dominican. I have a pretty good idea that he and Julio Rodriguez, if they don't know each other already, are going to bond, and that players want to be around something and someone special. And I think we've seen enough from Julio this year to know that he's the kind of player players are going to want to play with and be around. He's going to be our number one recruiting tool when it comes to free agents and keeping guys. And you hear pitchers rave about the Mariners' pitching development staff and how much they love working with them. So let's be optimistic and positive. maybe Luis Castillo falls in love with this city and falls in love with Julio and the organization and everything going on in it, wants to be a part of it, wants to be at the top of that rotation for years to come, and they can sign him to an extension. Until then, let's enjoy a playoff race, shall we? Be positive and enjoy watching a young ace pitch for the Mariners, okay? Let's have a good time. Go Mariners. We'll talk soon.